Could an AI ever become conscious? Maybe. But before we answer that, there's a much more uncomfortable question. How can we possibly know when we still don't understand what makes us conscious? I was watching Greene discuss this, and what started as a conversation about conscious machines quickly turned into something much bigger. Free will, particles, physical laws, simulation theory, and whether biology matters at all. And I kept noticing the same pattern. We seem remarkably confident about things we haven't actually figured out. Greene went to Diary of a CEO and was interviewed by Stephen Bartlett a few days ago. And although he doesn't claim that ChatGPT or Claude are conscious today, he says he's spoken to leading AI researchers who believe they might be. He does, however, think machine consciousness is possible, and personally I have nothing against that. I'm open to the idea as well. An LLM by itself, it's one thing. A future system with memory, a world model, perception, and perhaps entirely new components could be something very different. My problem isn't people saying artificial consciousness is possible. My problem is how quickly possible sometimes turns into we know exactly what would make it possible. Because Greene also seems confident that consciousness doesn't fundamentally depend on the biological material of the brain. In other words, silicon could potentially do the job. Maybe it can. But how do we know that? We don't know what actually produces consciousness. We don't know which properties of the brain are essential to it. So saying biology doesn't matter isn't a small assumption. If you genuinely know consciousness is substrate independent, congratulations, you've already discovered something extremely important about consciousness. And this is where the interview gets even more interesting. Greene is highly confident that humans don't have free will. His argument is that you are ultimately a collection of particles. Those particles obey the laws of physics, and you have no ability to interrupt that process. Raise your hand, and according to Greene, you didn't really decide to do it. Physics moved particles in your brain, an electrical signal traveled down your arm, your muscles responded, and your hand went up. You merely felt like you made the decision. But I immediately have a problem with that. Yes, another problem. Why are my brain obeyed physics and I made a decision mutually exclusive? My laptop obeys physics too. Every transistor, switching state follows physical processes, but I can still say the computer performed a calculation. The lower level mechanism doesn't automatically erase the higher level description. So when Greene says it wasn't really you who raised your hand because particles caused it, I'm not convinced. Those particles organized in that particular way are you. Stephen Bartlett then asks the obvious question. If I'm not making the decision, what is or who is? Greene says the best answer we have, it's some body of law. And when Bartlett asks what that means, Greene points to regularities in nature, patterns that repeat. Drop an apple and it falls. We describe these regularities mathematically and call them laws of physics. So far, I'm with him. But then Greene says there are fundamental patterns out there, and those patterns ultimately determine how the particles move. And that's where I have a problem. Because what exactly are these patterns? We observe that things repeatedly behave in certain ways, identify the regularity and describe it as a pattern. But Greene then seems to give that pattern causal power. The pattern determines how the particles move. Maybe there is some deeper physical structure doing exactly that. But calling it a pattern doesn't explain what it is or why it governs anything. We've gone from describing what repeatedly happens to apparently explaining why it happens. Those are not necessarily the same thing. He then says something else I find fascinating. Particles themselves don't care. Caring only emerges when particles form something sufficiently complex like a human brain. And from conscious self-awareness, he says, we invent concepts like happiness, meaning, purpose, morality, action, choice, and even free will. But please remember what he already told us. We don't actually author our decisions. What we experience as choosing is the lawful unfolding of particles. So how much work can these human constructs really be doing? Greene says calling these things human constructs doesn't diminish them. But I don't think you can just say that and move on. If my sense of choosing is a story, and what I actually do is determined by physical processes I don't actually control. Then the same applies when I decide what matters to me, what purpose I pursue, or what values guide my life. Maybe meaning survives perfectly well in that picture, but you've removed genuine authorship from the person whose meaning we are talking about. Surely that requires more explanation than it doesn't diminish it. And then we arrive at consciousness. Greene says very plainly that if you ask him where consciousness comes from, he doesn't know. Good, neither do I. Nobody does. But then he says he thinks it's just physical processes, and essentially, let's go with that. Well, no, let's not just go with that. That's the bit I want to understand. You can absolutely propose physicalism as the answer, but we can't acknowledge that consciousness remains unexplained, assume an answer, and then quietly let that assumption carry the rest of the argument. And this matters enormously when we bring AI back into the picture. Earlier, Greene argues that the biological substrate itself may not be particularly important. Consciousness, in principle, could emerge in silicon too. And maybe he's right. I'm not saying silicon consciousness is impossible, because I simply don't know, but I'm willing to say that I don't know. I'm saying because we don't know what produces consciousness in a biological brain, how can we confidently say that biology is irrelevant to producing it? Think about what that claim actually means. Somewhere in the brain, somehow, physical activity gives rise to subjective experience. We don't know which properties are essential to that happening. Yet, if I tell you with confidence that the same thing can happen in silicon, I've already told you something extremely important about consciousness. Whatever causes it does not depend on biology. That would be a major discovery. So if we haven't made that discovery, substrate independence should remain a hypothesis, not quietly become a premise. This is why I find the contrast with free will so interesting. When it comes to human agency, Greene is extremely willing to reduce the experience down to particles and physical law. You feel like you chose, but ultimately you didn't. Yet when it comes to consciousness, he's willing to entertain the idea that the phenomenon can survive a complete change of physical substrate. Those positions aren't necessarily contradictory, of course, but the confidence, in my opinion, it's striking. Agency gets reduced away, while consciousness might travel from biology to silicon. And strangely, I find something resembling free will much easier to imagine in a machine than consciousness. Given AI persistent goals, memory, a model of its environment, the ability to evaluate alternatives, plan ahead, learn from consequences, and initiate actions. And I'm comfortable saying the system is making choices in a meaningful operational sense. Of course, every transistor still obeys physics, but so does every neuron in my brain. Whether that machine actually experiences any of those choices, it's a completely different question. I think that distinction is important because we increasingly talk about AI agency and AI consciousness as though sophistication naturally leads from one to the other. It doesn't. A system could become extraordinarily autonomous without there being anything it feels like to be that system. And the opposite claim requires evidence we simply don't have. An AI telling me I chose this, it's evidence of behavior we can actually examine. An AI telling me I experienced this confronts us with the same consciousness problem we haven't solved in ourselves. I believe this also connects to Greene's interest in the idea that we might be living in a simulation. For that possibility to become really interesting, the simulated beings presumably need to be conscious, and Greene acknowledges the problem. We would first need to create computer systems capable of genuine self-awareness and consciousness. If that can happen, perhaps someone else already did it, and we are actually now inside their simulation. Fascinating possibility. But notice what we are relying on again. Consciousness being reproducible computationally in the first place. And there is another reason this way of reasoning caught my attention. Greene has spent decades working on string theory. String theory is mathematically extraordinary, and it might describe something fundamental about reality. But we still don't have experimental evidence establishing that it does. Greene knows that and openly acknowledges it. Beautiful mathematics can give us an incredibly compelling theory. Nature still gets the final vote, and I think we should demand at least the same humility when we talk about consciousness. Because with consciousness, we have even less to work with. We don't have a mathematical theory telling us why particular physical processes produce subjective experience. We don't know the necessary ingredients. We don't know whether biology matters. We don't even know whether computation alone can ever be sufficient. So when the conversation moves from I don't know what consciousness is to it could happen in silicon, I'm not saying stop asking the question. Quite the opposite. I'm saying recognize how enormous the question still is. And as we talked about patterns throughout this video, there is a pattern I kept noticing in this interview. Not that Greene's conclusions must be wrong. Maybe free will really is an illusion. Maybe consciousness is entirely physical and substrate independent. Maybe machines will become conscious. Maybe we are living in a simulation. But maybe matters. There are places where an observation becomes an assumption, and then that assumption starts carrying conclusions that sound much more certain than the thing underneath them. That's where I think we need to slow the argument down. And I think that's especially important when we talk about AI. We are building systems that increasingly talk like us, reason with us, and act with greater autonomy. That makes it incredibly tempting to project the rest of what we are, what we do, onto them. Understanding, experience, perhaps eventually consciousness. Maybe one day that projection will be justified. But similarity of behavior isn't an explanation of subjective experience. Before declaring that consciousness can simply move from neurons to silicon, I'd like us to answer the inconvenient question we skipped earlier. What is consciousness in the first place? And does it really live in neurons? If you like this kind of video, please make sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.